Most people have looked at overhead power lines during a storm and asked the same question. Why don't we just put all of this underground? It seems obvious. No wires hanging over streets, no poles leaning after high winds, no tree branches falling into distribution lines, no ice weighing down conductors, and no neighborhood skyline filled with wires, transformers, and utility poles. Underground power can look cleaner, feel safer, and in some situations, perform better during storms. But the real answer is more complicated, because when utilities decide whether power lines should be overhead or underground, they are not just choosing between ugly and clean. They are choosing between cost, reliability, repair time, construction difficulty, storm exposure, maintenance access, and long-term grid planning. Underground power is not automatically better. It is better in some places, for some reasons, under the right conditions, but it can be much harder to justify in other places. To understand why, you have to start with how most electric distribution systems are built. In many neighborhoods, electricity is delivered through overhead distribution lines. These are the lines you see running along streets, connected to wooden poles, transformers, switches, and service drops that run into homes and businesses. That design became common because it is relatively easy to build, easy to inspect, and easier to repair. If a tree limb falls onto an overhead wire, crews can usually see the damage. If a pole breaks, the problem is visible. If a transformer fails, crews can locate it, isolate the section, replace equipment, and restore power. That does not mean overhead systems are perfect. They are exposed to the environment every day. Wind can knock trees into wires, lightning can damage equipment, ice can weigh down conductors, vehicles can hit poles, animals can cause faults, and storms can create widespread outages across miles of exposed infrastructure. That is the biggest argument for undergrounding. When distribution lines are buried, they are protected from many of the things that damage overhead systems. Wind does not blow buried cables around, tree limbs do not fall onto underground conductors, ice does not build up on underground wires, and the system is visually cleaner because the poles and overhead wires are either reduced or removed. That is why underground distribution is common in many newer residential developments. When a neighborhood is being built from scratch, it is much easier to install underground electric service while roads, sidewalks, driveways, and utility corridors are already under construction. The ground is open, the layout is planned, other utilities can be coordinated, and the cost can be built into the overall development. That is very different from taking an existing neighborhood with overhead wires and converting it to underground service after the fact. Retrofitting an older neighborhood is expensive and disruptive. Crews may need to trench along streets, sidewalks, lawns, and driveways. They may need to avoid water mains, gas lines, sewer pipes, telecom cables, storm drains, and other underground utilities. They may need to install ducts, vaults, handholds, transformers, switches, and new service connections to each customer. Roads may need to be opened and restored. Traffic may need to be redirected. Permits may be required. Customer property may be affected, and the utility may need to coordinate with municipalities, contractors, property owners, and other utility companies. So when people ask, why not just put the lines underground, the word just is doing a lot of work. Undergrounding is not just moving a wire from the air into the ground. It can be a major civil construction project, and that leads to the biggest barrier, cost. Underground distribution usually costs much more than overhead construction. The exact difference depends on the location, soil conditions, voltage level, urban density, permitting, labor costs, and how much existing infrastructure has to be moved or rebuilt. In general, overhead lines are far cheaper and faster to install. With overhead construction, crews can set poles, string conductors, install transformers, and access equipment from bucket trucks. With underground construction, the utility may need trenching, conduit systems, specialized cable, underground vaults, pad-mounted equipment, excavation crews, road restoration, and more complex coordination with other infrastructure. That cost does not disappear. It usually ends up being paid through rates, municipal programs, developer costs, special assessments, or some combination of funding mechanisms. This is one of the reasons utilities do not simply underground every circuit. The question is not whether undergrounding would be nice. The question is whether the benefit justifies the cost. In some places, the answer is yes. For example, undergrounding may make sense in dense downtown areas where overhead pole lines are impractical. It may make sense in some new subdivisions where underground service can be designed from the beginning. It may make sense in areas with repeated storm damage, heavy tree exposure, or critical infrastructure. It may also make sense where local governments or developers are willing to pay for the improved aesthetics and reduced overhead exposure. But in a rural area with long distances between customers, undergrounding every mile of line may be incredibly expensive relative to the number of people served. If a circuit runs through wooded, rocky, or low-density terrain, the economics can become difficult very quickly. That is why utilities often prioritize undergrounding selectively. They may focus on the worst-performing circuits. They may underground short sections that repeatedly fail. They may target areas near hospitals, emergency services, downtown corridors, transportation routes, or major development zones. They may combine undergrounding with broader grid modernization, roadwork, or municipal redevelopment. In other words, undergrounding is usually not an all-or-nothing decision. It is often targeted. Now, there is another trade-off that people do not always consider. Underground systems can be less exposed to storms, but when they do fail, they can be harder and slower to repair. With overhead lines, damage is often visible. A broken pole, downed wire, or blown transformer can be found quickly. With underground systems, the problem may be hidden below the surface. Crews may need specialized fault locating equipment to identify where the cable failed. They may need access to underground vaults or pull cable through conduit. If the cable is directly buried, repair may require excavation. If the failure is under a road, sidewalk, driveway, or landscaped area, restoration becomes more complicated. That means underground systems may experience fewer outages from wind and trees, but some underground outages can take longer to diagnose and repair. This is one of the most important differences. Overhead systems are more exposed, but easier to assess. Underground systems are more protected, but harder to reach. That trade-off shapes the way utilities think about reliability. Reliability is not just about preventing outages. It is also about how quickly power can be restored when something goes wrong. An overhead circuit may be more vulnerable during a storm, but crews can often patrol the line and identify visible damage. An underground circuit may avoid that storm damage, but if a cable fails underground, the repair can be more technical and time-consuming. Neither system is perfect. They just fail differently. Underground equipment also has its own risks. Water intrusion can damage underground cables and connectors. Flooding can affect the vaults and pad-mounted equipment. Soil movement can stress cables. Dig-ins from construction crews can damage underground infrastructure. Older underground cables can deteriorate over time. And if underground systems are not mapped and maintained carefully, repairs and future construction become more difficult. This is especially important in cities where the underground space is already crowded. Below the street, there may be electric cables, gas mains, water lines, sewer lines, fiber optic cables, steam systems, drainage infrastructure, and abandoned facilities from older utility work. Installing new underground electric infrastructure in that environment can be extremely complex. It is not just a technical decision, it is a coordination problem. Every underground project has to respect what is already in the ground. That is why the location matters so much. In a new development, underground power can be clean and efficient to install. In an old city street, it may be expensive, slow, and difficult. In a suburban neighborhood, it may depend on whether the area has repeated outage issues, how the homes are laid out, and whether the community is willing to absorb the cost. In a rural area, the long distances can make full undergrounding hard to justify. The voltage levels also matter. Undergrounding residential distribution is one thing. Undergrounding high-voltage transmission lines is another. Transmission lines move large amounts of power over long distances. Putting high-voltage transmission underground can require specialized cable systems, cooling considerations, major excavation, transition stations, and significantly higher costs. That does not mean it never happens. Underground transmission is used in some dense urban areas, underwater crossings, environmentally sensitive corridors, and places where overhead lines are not practical. But for long-distance bulk power transfer, overhead transfer is usually far more economical and easier to maintain. This is why you still see large steel transmission towers crossing open land. They may not be beautiful, but they are effective for moving power at scale. So when people talk about undergrounding, it is important to separate distribution from transmission. The small lines serving neighborhoods are one category. The high-voltage lines moving power across regions are another. The costs, equipment, engineering, and repair challenges are very different. There is also a customer side impact. In an overhead system, the service line may come from a pole to the weatherhead on a house. In an underground system, service may come from a pad-mounted transformer or underground connection to the meter. If an existing neighborhood is converted, individual customer services may need to be modified. That can involve coordination at each property. For businesses, large buildings, or older homes, this can add complexity. So even if the main utility line is placed underground, the conversion may still require work on the customer side. That is another reason these projects are not simple. The utility grid is not one single wire. It is a system of circuits, transformers, switches, meters, service connections, protection devices, and customer equipment. Changing one part can affect many others. This does not mean undergrounding is a bad idea. In many cases, it is a very good idea. It can reduce exposure to trees and storms, it can improve neighborhood appearance, it can support new development, it can protect certain circuits from repeated weather-related damage. It can be especially valuable in areas where outages are frequent and the cost of disruption is high. But undergrounding is not a universal fix. It does not eliminate all outages, it does not remove all maintenance, it does not make repairs automatically faster, and it does not come without cost. The better question is not, why don't we all put power lines underground? The better question is, where does undergrounding create the most value? That is how utilities, regulators, developers, and municipalities usually have to think about it. A downtown redevelopment project may justify underground service because the density, aesthetics, and public investment align. A new housing development may install underground service because it is efficient to do it before the streets and homes are complete. A storm-prone circuit may justify selective undergrounding because the reliability improvement is meaningful. But a long rural feeder serving relatively few customers may not make sense to underground across its entire length. The value depends on the location, the risk, the customer impact, and the cost. That is the real story of underground power. It is not that utilities refuse to modernize, and it is not that overhead lines exist only because nobody thought of burying them. The electric grid was built across thousands of miles over many decades through different communities, terrains, budgets, and engineering standards. Overhead infrastructure remains common because it is cost-effective, accessible, and practical. Underground infrastructure is powerful, but expensive, complex, and harder to repair. The future will probably include more undergrounding, especially in new developments, dense areas, targeted reliability projects, and places where storm exposure creates repeated problems. But it will likely be selective, not universal, because the goal is not to make every line invisible. The goal is to build an electric system that balances reliability, affordability, safety, access, and long-term performance. Underground power can be part of that system. But like most things in the electric grid, the right answer depends on the circuit, the community, and the cost. This is GridState, where the electric system gets explained one layer at a time.